through this without killing over on the coffee fit or something. So I apologize if I'm not as loud as usual. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And I am thankful to the Lord because I feel better than yesterday. So it's always a silver lining, and could be a lot worse. So anyway, we're going to be continuing our study this morning with Daniel chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn over there as we continue our study of this great Old Testament book. I've had a lot of fun studying through this book together. And last week we took a little bit of a pause in our study of the text itself to consider the transition between the Babylonian kingdom and the Persian kingdom, fall of Babylon, the accession to power of Persia and Media, and so I hope that was an informative and helpful study as well. It always helps me to understand the historical context of what we're reading in the Bible. Makes it a lot more understandable, come to life for us. This is not just some made-up fiction that we're reading here, but this is actual real world history. So Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to kick off here today. Is there anybody here that does not know the story of Daniel in the lion's den? I think probably just about everybody, even if they haven't been to church very often, if at all, probably heard this story at some point, know a little bit about it. So Daniel chapter 6, we're going to start in verse 1. Verse 1, it says, "It pleased Darius." Now remember, he was the one who had conquered Babylon and killed Belshazzar, the king of the Babylonians we read about in the last chapter. "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was found in him. And the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion nor fault, forasmuch as he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute, and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree, and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medians and the Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore, King Darius signed the writing and the decree." I'm going to pause right there. This chapter of Daniel breaks logically up into 2 portions, and I want to focus mostly on verses 1 through 9 today. We've been taking these chapters in the book of Daniel really in about 2-week increments, right? And trying to chop them up that way, just so we have time to cover everything in some fair way. Well, we've noted all along through the book of Daniel the theme of God's sovereignty, the theme of God's ultimate reign and control over the affairs of men, not just the kingdoms of the world, but in personal lives as well, all through chapters 1 through 6. Now, Daniel chapter 7 through 12, the second half of the book, really is going to turn its focus elsewhere, and I'm not going to jump ahead to getting into that so much, but it's not unlike the book of Revelation. We find a focus on the battle between God's people and the dominions of Satan in the world in the first half of the book. In the second half of the book, we pull back and you see a bigger picture of the battle between Christ and Satan himself. And so it develops in that way, both in the book of Daniel, which is one of the key books of prophecy about the end times, and also in the book of Revelation, the end of all things. Now, in fact, the theme of God's absolute control over the universe, his absolute rule, it's reiterated in the very final confession of the first half of the book of Daniel here. We're not reading all the way through to the end of the chapter, but we do see at the end, or towards the end of this chapter, in verse 26, Darius says this: "And after all the happenings of Daniel chapter 6, I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end." Well, we can see a good summary or synopsis of the first 6 chapters in what Darius finally says here, and that's been true of the other kings that we've read about as well. Nebuchadnezzar primarily, Belshazzar to a very small degree, even though he was a rebel against God. Well, that theme is really the great theme of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is a great encouragement to me because it reiterates that we serve God whose kingdom shall never end. And despite everything that goes on in this world around us, despite discouragement on the political level, despite discouragement in our personal, family lives, God's in control. And God will have the final say in all of it. Even in the face of the severest persecution, God's kingdom will never be moved. It's the kingdom that I want to be a part of. Daniel calls us to sacrificial action in the face of persecution, even in a pagan culture. And though we didn't read through all of chapter 6, you can see the proclamation that's made here by Darius and these other leaders against, ultimately, what's going to be against Daniel himself and against the Lord God. And so there's tremendous persecution being brought to bear against God's kingdom and against God's people. God never changes. Before it's over, Darius himself is going to acknowledge that. Well, the story that's recorded for us in Daniel chapter 6, it takes place in the reign of yet another pagan king, just like we read about in these past chapters, in this case Darius. First we had Nebuchadnezzar, who ultimately and absolutely humbled himself before God, didn't he? Took some serious work on God's part to bring him to that point. But then there was Belshazzar, who learned God's severe judgment to those who will rebel against the truth that they are shown. We can see the theme of the scriptures, that when God gives spiritual light, when he gives truth to us, we are doubly accountable at that point in time. And God sometimes doesn't cut us a whole lot of slack if we rebel against that truth that we've been given. And that was the case with Belshazzar, where God was extremely long-suffering with Nebuchadnezzar, who had not been introduced to Almighty God prior to our readings in Daniel. And God dealt with him for years and years and years. With Belshazzar, well, God also dealt with him behind the scene for years, we know. But when it finally came to Daniel chapter 5 with the handwriting on the wall, there was no more opportunity for him. It was just, hey, your kingdom's been numbered and it's been found wanting, and tonight you're going to die. That's it. Now, Belshazzar showed his true colors and not really caring about that message and just continuing his drunken party, and God's judgment fell. Well, now we have this other king that comes on the scene here, Darius, an incredibly pagan Persian king. If you thought that Babylon was a wild and pagan culture for God's people to live in, Persia is even worse. And I'm not going to take a lot of time getting into the depravity and craziness of the Persian culture, but it doesn't take very much study on your part to be able to see some of that. Remember, Persia and Media, they are united kingdoms that are working together to form this massive empire, this expansive empire that's referenced here. And while sometimes the Persians were in a little bit more power, and sometimes the Medes were in a little more power, they were working together as a unified force. And so you can see these different individuals referenced. You have Darius, the Mede here, and in the next chapter we're going to have Cyrus, the Persian. And so you have this mutual work that's being done there, but it is an incredibly pagan empire. Now, despite all that, we learn through this book that kings come and kings go, nations come and nations go, reigns and rules come and they go, but God's kingdom persists. God's kingdom is going to reign supreme. And that's pictured in some small way in the constant continuity that Daniel himself, as a man, has throughout all these different kings. He kind of transcends all the comings and goings of these various rules. Daniel's God is indeed the living God, of whose kingdom there will never be an end. And as God's kingdom continues to reign supreme, Daniel continues serving in the court in Babylon and now in the court of Persia and Media. And we're told at the very last of chapter 5 that Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62 years old. So we have this 62-year-old ruler of what is now the largest empire in the world that is ever known in history up to that point in time. Incredible power that this man has. The Media-Persia kingdom or empire stretched all the way to the Atlantic Ocean past modern-day Libya, and that's down in the African continent. And it stretched in the east all the way to India in southern Asia. It stretched in the north towards Turkey, modern-day Turkey for us. We see that called Asia Minor in the New Testament in the Bible. It's a massive kingdom, sprawling empire. And of course, because of that, it had a tremendous need for organization. You can only imagine. Efficient organization was needed. Now, it's not surprising that the words of Daniel chapter 6 reflects that all sorts of bureaucratic officials were being appointed. And it's just going to naturally take place. Rulers and leaders are needed. Now, in the ancient world, there were no cars, there were no planes, there were no telegrams, there were no telegraphs, there were no computers or email or text messaging or anything of that sort. And I think that we probably have a hard time wrapping our minds around the difficulties in communication that would exist. How easily a portion of the empire might rise up against those that were ruling then and begin to rebel and to accumulate power and growth before home station ever even knew that anything was going on. And so there was a tremendous need here for a massive administration to keep together an organization so far-flung as the Mede-Persian Empire. That's precisely what's reflected for us here in Daniel chapter 6. That's why there's so much emphasis given to all the different leaders and rulers that are appointed. Now, and I'm just trying to give you a little bit of context as we go into the study on the Persian Empire. You'll also notice that in the book itself, there are similarities between Daniel chapter 3. If you remember, that's where Nebuchadnezzar had all of the different rulers of his far-flung empire come together, and he had built that massive 90-foot-tall gold idol of himself that he required everybody to come and worship. And you see some reflection of that same type of event that was happening there. There's a little bit of repetition. Remember, in that case, it almost was kind of like a broken record. It was reiterating over and over for us 3 or 4 or 5 times all the presidents and the princes and the blah, 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 blah. And they gave the entire list of all the people that were there representing the empire. And they came and they fell down and they worshipped the golden image. And there were 3 men that stood out from everybody else, and they were Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Remember the 3? And they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace as a result of their stand for God. They said, hey, we don't have to even be careful to give you an answer in this matter, King. We know what we stand for. You can throw us in the fire if you want to, but we're going to stand for God. We're going to have to give a second thought to it. Well, so here in Daniel chapter 6, there's this continual repetition of the fact that there's all of these rulers and representatives that are there, collaborating together, working for Darius in this case, willing to do whatever it is that he wants. And you can also see a repetition of this phrase. Don't miss it. The laws of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked, right? That cannot be reversed. You see that phrase emphasized over and over and over again. It's the book of Daniel. It's almost mocking that principle. It's kind of funny as you read through it. Daniel is reiterating that. The law of the Medes and the Persians, it can't be changed. It can't be altered. Yeah, right. But we'll show you how God changed that. God can overrule. Watch what our God does. So there's a use of repetition again, and a certain amount of maybe irony or humor that's brought into the reading here. But the contrast is that whereas Daniel's friends were asked to commit a specific sin by bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar's idol, all that Daniel is asked to do is to omit a responsibility for 30 days. Now, it's important to know in this study that sin can be either something that is overtly committed by us, or it can be something important that God tells us to do that is omitted and we simply fail to do. They are both equivalent sins as far as God's concerned. And so, one last thing here, you may be wondering as we just do our introduction, why is there a pit of lions around in the days of the Babylonians and now especially the Persians? Well, you don't have to look too far into history to see that lion hunting was called the sport of kings. Those lions were kept not unlike foxes would have been kept until the English Parliament ended the sport of fox hunting. Lions were frequently kept handy for the king to go hunting. It was also a nice way of disposing of undesirable members of your court. Didn't take very long to get rid of people that way, both in Persian times and later on in Roman times. Everybody here has probably heard some of Roman history, the Colosseums that they had. It was not infrequent for people to be thrown to the lions if they fell into disfavor with the emperor. And so it wasn't just a practice that was invented to eliminate unwanted Christians, although that was frequently utilized as well. In fact, we even see Paul referenced in the New Testament. He had to fight wild beasts in the city of Ephesus. He doesn't dwell on that, but he makes reference to it. That was a frequent thing for Christians to suffer and endure. It was a frequent thing for anybody who fell out of favor with the courts to endure. And it wasn't something that you survived, folks, not at least in most cases. And so this is not something that is undocumented in history. You can see a lot of references to it, and we see it here as well. Well, there's one major point that I want to make this morning, now that I've given you this background to chapter 6. I want to focus on the first 9 verses, because here we see a picture of real life spiritual warfare that's taking place in the trenches. This is not an obscure thing that's going on behind the scenes, but this is something that is very blatant. It's up front, it's in your face, it's something that we can relate to even in our lives, that there may be instances like that where we encounter spiritual warfare as well. Hey, spiritual warfare is a real thing, all right? Frankly, we're often not cognizant of it because we're really not engaged in it. It's easy for us to live like the world and to accept the standards of the world and not to be opposed as a result of that by the forces of evil. But you start living for God, you start standing up for God's truth, hell's going to unleash all of its forces on you. And we can see that taking place here in the book of Daniel, chapter 6. A very clear picture of spiritual warfare. In the New Testament, the Lord Jesus himself faced the last great temptation of his life in the Garden of Gethsemane. We studied that a few weeks ago. It stretched into the hours on the cross where everything that he knew and loved was brought into question. Just a tremendous warfare that was taking place against his soul there. And Daniel faces this last great temptation of his life. that we can see recorded for us. We're never given a list of the different temptations and difficulties that Daniel went through, but I think that we can rightly assume that there were an awful lot of them. The major highlights that are recorded for us in these last 6 chapters of Daniel are phenomenal, astronomical type of temptations and difficulties that God's people went through. I'm sure that there was plenty of others behind the scenes that simply aren't recorded for us in the Bible. In Daniel's 60 plus or 70 plus years of living in Babylon and Persia, there's a lot of it he dealt with in his life. Now, there are no more that are listed for us in Daniel after this point. Daniel's going to record a lot of different things, but it's going to be more prophetic in nature. And this is kind of the end of the telling of the story of the life of Daniel for us. But this is the culmination here of the temptations brought against Daniel. And it really gives us, again, a picture of spiritual warfare and also the amazing spiritual strength and maturity of this man Daniel. I want you to notice, as we talk about Daniel being a picture of spiritual warfare here, I want you to notice the 2 themes that are spoken of clearly here in the first 9 verses of the chapter. Now, first of all, what comes through very, very clearly to me as I read this is the insecurity of human government. Absolute insecurity. Political power and government, no matter how awesome they are, no matter how mighty and far-flung they are basically insecure, aren't they? There's really not a lot of stability to it. Now here we have, we're told in verse 2, that you have all of these 120 princes that are appointed across the entire empire, right? And in verse 2, we can see that there are 3 presidents that need to be appointed over them to monitor them and to keep an eye on what they're doing so that the king would not suffer loss, so the king would have no damages. Apparently, there was a tremendous corruption in the government. Surprise, surprise. Sound familiar? I mean, we have it today at all levels of government, from the local level all the way up to the federal level, to the international level. Just absolute corruption in government. And so the king has attempted to set up a governmental organization, a structure, to prevent people from undercutting his rule and taking advantage of their own power that they've been delegated. You can imagine in an empire that spread as far as the empire of the Medes and the Persians, and an empire as wealthy and as powerful as that, there would be plenty of room for people trying to line their own pockets, trying to get rich, trying to bolster their own power. And it was precisely because of that fact, precisely because of that fear, that the king is appointing these presidents to oversee all of the princes that are there. Now, the insecurity of government, it is seen very clearly here to me. But in the midst of all of this corruption, all of this distrust of these rulers, one man stood out. One man. Now we've seen this repeated over and over again for us throughout the study of Daniel, where there's one man, or in some cases 3 men that stood out, but they're vastly in the minority. And yet, one person standing out, or 3 men standing out, just shine through so brightly, like a light piercing the darkness. Daniel, captive of Judah. He was a man that Darius knew that he could trust. It's phenomenal to me. I really don't know how Daniel rose to this position of power under Darius. We see that he had already been appointed right at the end of the Babylonian reign as the 3rd leader in the country. Now maybe there was a practice on the part of the Persians to keep installed good leaders from previous regimes. I don't know. Whatever it is, he trusts Daniel implicitly, to the point that he actually appoints. So you have this hierarchical structure in the empire. You have 120 princes that were vast in their authority and their rulership, and 3 presidents that presided over all of those 120. I don't know how those were broken up. And then you've got one man that's set over them all, and that's Daniel. I mean, It says that Darius trusted Daniel from beginning to end, and even when Darius is caught in the trap of his own making later on in this chapter, he never questioned the integrity of Daniel even one time. Not even a hint of question about his integrity. He always put his mind to how he could deliver Daniel from that situation that Darius himself had created. Even though in the end it wouldn't be Darius who would be Daniel's savior. It would be somebody else. Well, there's also a continuing dynamic that has started far earlier in the book that I think is noteworthy. The wise men, the soothsayers, the astrologers, the magicians of that part of the world would have been they have been, I should say, in constant conflict with Daniel and his three friends all through the Babylonian reign, haven't they? They've come after him with all the ferocity in their hearts from start to finish. Even when Darius brings out this new law, or it's brought before him, you can see that there's a lot of underhanded work behind the scenes on the part of these other rulers, and we can only presume some influence from the wise men and some influence from those other counselors of previous kings. The tremendous conflict here that they have against Daniel. Daniel and his three friends consistently throughout our study have been right. And these guys have consistently been shown to be a farce. They're fakes. They're frauds. They're charlatans. They've habitually been shown to be wrong. They have looked for an opportunity to strike back at God's people for years. Now they have their chance at last. They have kind of a blank slate here. They have a new king that they can come in and try to manipulate. Now the other theme that I want to point to your attention is the theme of the conflict between the kingdoms of darkness and the kingdoms of light. We're talking a little bit about the spiritual warfare that we can see pictured for us here. The great theme of this chapter, as really of all the chapters of Daniel, is the conflict between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of this world. Don't miss it. In this case, the conflict occurs between the law of God and the law of the Medes and the Persians. I mentioned earlier that phrase is reiterated for us several times because it becomes an outstanding theme here. Which law is going to prevail? Which one is going to stand above the other? And so we have a conflict between God and man, between his kingdom and the kingdom of this world. Now I want you to note several things about Daniel himself as we consider this chapter. And again, I know a lot of this is more just contextual for you, and we'll get into the actual story of Daniel's behaviors in the face of being thrown into the lion's den next week. Daniel is aged now, tremendously aged. You remember in the last chapter, we've already said that Daniel was well advanced in years. In fact, he was old enough to have been forgotten in the court of Belshazzar. But now probably somewhere between 70 and 80 years old. He's described as a man with an extraordinary spirit. What a blessing it would have been for Daniel, who has been left in relative obscurity under the last reign, to know that he was going to be brought out again to serve his God. And not only to serve his God, but to serve him in a climactic way towards the end of his life. You know, Daniel is of the same generation as Darius. Darius is only about 10 years his junior. But throughout this passage, throughout the whole chapter of Daniel 6, Daniel's integrity is constantly contrasted against Darius's gullibility, his self-serving interests, his pride. Darius may be the king, but it's Daniel who has composure. It's Daniel who has grace in the midst of fire. Notice also that this temptation that Daniel faces is part of a larger satanic strategy that's operating. These other court officials that we've read about here were tempting Daniel because they wanted to get him out of the way. But in reality, these men were minions of Satan. That's all that they really were. They were pawns in his game. Satan himself was simultaneously working in the designs of these petty officials against God's kingdom in the time of Darius. Satan had been attempting all throughout the study of our book for approximately 60 years now of history. He's been attempting to wear out and wear down Daniel. Temptations to compromise in my life and in your life are never isolated incidents, but they're part of a larger strategy of Satan against us. And that reminds us, friends, the temptation is not a battle. It's a war. It's one that lasts all of our lives as we seek to follow the Lord. Satan does not tempt you once and leave you alone, or twice and leave you alone. He's always looking for an opportunity to undo you. So our victories in temptation, they're not victories so that we can immediately experience rest and reprieve from the spiritual war that we're in. They're victories in order to prepare us for the next and the greater temptations that we'll face. In fact, that is precisely how God, in his overall control, uses the wild ways of Satan in our lives. Temptation prepares us for the next assault of Satan, to make us more faithful and more able to endure the slanders and the attacks of the evil one. Think about it. All of the previous temptations of Daniel were simply to prepare him for his last great conflict here. He learned some tremendous lessons from the past difficulties and temptations he'd gone through. Now he was ready to face this one. I notice in this passage, particularly in verses 4 through 7, the guile and the cunning and the deception of these court officials. We've seen them identified somewhat by name, or at least by position, in the first 3 verses. You get a picture of precisely what King Darius was trying to protect himself from as you see these men deal with Daniel. He's trying to protect himself from their underhanded, undercutting, deceitful ways. Now that, in and of itself, reminds us of the contrast between the integrity of Daniel and the wheeling and dealing and deceit of these men. By the way, all opposition to God is inherently deceptive. It always is. Look at verse 7. All right, so here, verses 4 through 7, you have these guys come to the realization the only way that we're going to find to undercut Daniel and get rid of him is if we find it regarding his worship of the Lord. And so they come up with this concept, and in verse 7, they come and present to King Darius. They butter him up a little bit with their words, and then they say, all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains, having consulted together. So Daniel's consulted with them. And Daniel's agreed to this. The greatest counselor in the land, the one who's actually set over and appointed over all of them, he's agreed. No, the very first words out of their mouths to the king are an absolute lie. In fact, the very first word, the word all. No, all of them haven't consulted together. They lie, because you cannot oppose God without deception, or at least without self-deception in some way. Again, note that they concocted a scheme that seemed to serve Darius' interests, right? But it was really designed to serve their own interest, and it was going to undercut Darius' authority. It was going to undercut the integrity of his kingdom. They weren't looking out for their Lord and Master here. They were looking out for themselves. And again, this incident, it's just a segue and a preface into the greater conflict between darkness and light. The spiritual warfare between God's kingdom and the kingdom of darkness And that conflict is going to become far more apparent to us in Daniel chapter 7 through 12. All of the warfare that's going on behind the scenes that we're oblivious to sometimes. Now, unfortunately, we see in the world around that very, very few great men finish well. That wasn't the case for Daniel. In this, his greatest hour of temptation, we can see Daniel savoring the opportunity to die for his Lord, if necessary. Remarkable. Any one of us likely would have been wringing our hands, but Daniel immediately senses that his whole life leads up to this moment to stand for his God. This is the moment where he can stand for the Lord in the most brilliant way, in the way that shines in the brightest way. This is the moment where he can testify of his loyalty for the Lord. And this is the moment that God, the God of Israel,